Okay, so this is the final lesson, writing a research report. And this will give you some idea about, will be helpful when preparing your final report for this course. So a structure of a research report will contain a title of the study, usually the author's name and affiliation, an abstract, an introduction. Normally now, an APA, they don't use the word introduction, uses the title instead. But you still would actually include an introduction, just not the heading. Finally, you have also the methods, and these subheadings can vary by journal and um, by the topic being discussed, but these are some of the more common ones that you would want to include: participants, measures, procedures, and data analysis. Um, and for yours, you normally would have results and discussions, but in yours, you're not going to have the results and discussions, but you will have references. So this is generally a layout of a research report. And again, there's an example of your how to do a research report in the folder here in the Blackboard. So the first is the title. The title typically is 10 to 15 words long, and sometimes you'll find that people will not come up with the title until the end of their project or their study. Sometimes when writing it up, it could dictate, or at least they may have a title to start out with, and then it might change as they have written the rest of the manuscript. Now, it's important in the title to include major variables of the study, and also the populations of special interest are identified in the title. And the reason for this is it makes it easier for people when they're doing a search to find your study if they're looking for a particular variable or a population. Now, these are two different ways to identify a title. Now, one thing I would recommend, the most effective titles tends to give almost the take-home message that you want the reader to get. So here is a more descriptive title. It just talks about the association, but here indicates more outdoor exercise improves symptoms. So this title, I think, is a little bit more effective because it really is the take-home message for the entire article. Where here it kind of leaves the reader guessing about what was really the findings of the study. But either one, this is more descriptive, and this tends to get a little bit more of an idea of what the outcome of the take-home message is. But either one can be used and be effective. Just make sure you include the variables as well as the population in the title itself. Now, abstract is a relatively short summary of the research report. It tends to come after or at the beginning of a report. And again, it's just a summary of the research report. Now, its purpose is to give readers an overview so they can determine the relevance of the research to their research or their practice. And when you're doing a lit review, you'll see the abstract that's going to be usually displayed when you're doing like a PubMed search. Now, at a minimum, it should state the purpose of the study, identify the participants and measures used, and briefly state the results of the study and the implications of the study. So usually like a 1 or 2 sentence for conclusion. Now, that's when you're doing a manuscript that followed through and has completed the entire research study. Now, a research proposal would mean you're proposing to do something, does not include the results or the brief discussion of the implications because you haven't yet completed the study. So in yours research proposal, your abstract would conclude with the type of measures that you would use, and you would not have anything related to results or the implications because you won't actually be completing the study in this class, but more of a proposal. But again, this is just an abstract. It's a nice brief summary of the research report. Well, here's an example of an abstract, and that is common. And you can see that here we have the stricken part. Here is the discussion and the conclusion, and this will not be included in your proposal. However, the rest of it will be included in your proposal. And the first 2 sentences is essentially some background information. However, beginning with the 3rd sentence, this is the purpose of the study. And normally, in this particular case, it's in the past tense. We compared because they're talking about something they have completed. However, in your research proposal, since it's a proposal, you would change that to say, we will compare. So in your proposal, I'll be looking for wordage that talks about things you will do in the future because you have not yet done it. So the first two sentences or the background will be in potentially past tense, but going after that, the purpose on, which should be in the future tense. So the next part is the introduction. And the introduction is very important because it leads the reader to why the study was done. And this is going to be very important because it really tries to grab the reader's attention. And you open with the introduction with a paragraph that introduces the research problem and the importance of studying it. Now, the first sentence or two should be specific to the research topic. Here's an example where it might be too broad. Obesity is a major global health concern worldwide. The prevalence of obesity among adults is about 13%. More specific to your reader would be childhood obesity is a major public health concern in the United States, whereas the prevalence of obesity among 2 to 9-year-olds is 19-year-olds is approximately 17%. So you have to make sure that you decide which one would be the most effective for you when doing it, but usually they're a little bit more specific. But again, you want to start to lead the reader to why the study was needed to be done. And well, that's when the next paragraphs come in. And so the following 3 to 4 paragraphs summarize the relevant literature so that the reader will understand why you are interested in the question you ask. In other words, identifies the gaps in the research literature. Now, the final paragraph should end with a hypothesis. And now the final paragraph, again, is going to end with a hypothesis. So it ends with a paragraph explaining the purpose of your study and the specific questions or hypothesis you had prior to conducting this study. So again, you may want to start broad at the beginning of the introduction, but you want to start to lead the reader over the next several paragraphs as to the gaps in the literature and therefore the reason why your proposal is important. And then you'll end with a specific questions or a hypothesis as to why this study is needed to be done. Now, here is an example of a hypothesis statement at the end of an introduction. And this can be used for helping you in terms of writing your introduction in your final paragraph. And so you can see how they start out with talking about reviewing what has been done. So in this study, we aimed, so again, starting with what your purpose, the aimed, or what your purpose is, to assess multidimensional responses. And then it lists the variables that are going to be studied. And then compared it to a standardized acute psychosocial stressor among, and here's your population, the young healthy men and women. And also talks about how it's going to compare stress responses between individuals who reported regular physical exercise and those who do not. So again, in this first sentence or the final paragraph of the introduction, it reiterates the aims, who are the variables that are going to be studied, and also the population. And then it starts to talk about, reiterates the gaps. So to our knowledge, no studies have measured these multidimensional aspects of stress response, so forth and so on. And then it talks about, furthermore, very few studies have examined stress-induced changes, et cetera, et cetera. So these next several sentences talk about the gaps in the literature. And again, in yours, it'll be important for you to read these in and talk about in future tense. Finally, it ends with a hypothesis. And in this case, this is why the study needs to be done. And here's why what we expect to have happened. Now, again, you can use this as an example when doing your proposal. So keep that in mind. And here's a link if you'd like to the actual link to the article itself. But this gives you hopefully an idea of what that final paragraph in the introduction should look like. So the next section is the methods section, is participants. And the first subheading of the methods section is, again, participants, and it should be italicized and flush left. Now, under this subheading, the researcher reports on the number of participants, how they were recruited, your sampling strategies such as random sampling, and selected inclusion and exclusion criteria. What did you decide to how did you go about selecting your participants, and the relevant demographics of the participants. For example, how old, male or female, training status, if it needs to be experienced or novice. So these are the things that you'd want to include discussing participants. And in your proposal thing, you should write it in the future tense since you have not yet completed that. So make sure you write what you will be doing in the methods section under participants. And here is an example of what a participants section would be. Notice though, this is in the past tense. Again, yours will be in the future tense. But normally in the participants, you would include the number, the mean age, their potential body mass, their height, and then you would go on and talk about a brief overview of what they did in terms of their experience. And then you will go on to, again, there's a table that will be included that kind of gives an overview of their experience and just a summary of it. And then their exclusion criteria. You can see some exclusion criteria and also what they were refrained from doing. So this gives an overview of really what the idea of what the participants, what they were like. Now in your proposal, since you have not completed it, you won't have any ages or any data to report. So this should not be included in your proposal. But the rest of it should be in the future tense about what you plan to be doing with the participants. Now, in terms of their mean age, you can still talk about what you plan in terms of a range of age. We plan to recruit participants between the ages of 18 and 25 with a BMI of 20 to 25. So those are the things that how you would write this for your proposal. The next section is deals with methods, and this is very important. The methods are under measures, I should say. And again, it's italicized and flush left. And when instruments or equipment are used, the researcher should identify the instrument and what is supposed to measure, and should also include the manufacturer and city. And so we talked about this briefly, that in the body of the text, you're going to indicate the type of measure that you did, and then indicate where the company and where it's located. And you can see that here's an example. The DEXA bone densitometer will be used to assess total fat and lean mass and percent body fat. Now here's an example if you're using a questionnaire. Psychology or behavioral questionnaires are used. The author should identify the name of the questionnaire, what is supposed to measure, an example item for the measure, how it is scored, and cite the study that assessed the measure's development and validity. And you can see here's how it was written, but you want to provide enough detail for the reader so they can essentially replicate the questionnaire. So, and also you want to give a rationale as to why this particular behavior or psychological questionnaire was used. So anytime you're describing any type of dependent variable, how you're going to assess that, you would do it here. Now here's an example of what your section and method section might look like. Notice that you have measures, and then you have the first is demographics, discussing the participants. Then you talk about in this particular case, if you're doing anthropometric characteristics, what you will be studying, what will be the dependent variables, and then how you will go about measuring those. Notice that there's quite a bit of detail, and it's important to give your audience, your reader, the detail because in case they need to replicate it, and also it shows that you provided a lot of thought into what went into the measuring the dependent variables. Err on the side of more detail as opposed to less. And also here's another example for physical activity and sedentary behavior, some questionnaire, how that would be written. Again, notice the detail that was provided and to give the reader an idea of why it was done and how it was done. And again, if they wanted to ever replicate the study, they could do so by reading your report. So here's the next section is procedures. Very important. As it says, this is how you went about doing the study. So the researcher would report on all the relevant steps they took in conducting the study. So take the reader through step by step of what you did to conduct your research. And again, more detail the better. Imagine that you're the reader, and take them through the study is really what you want to do in this step. And there should be enough information to allow another scientist to repeat your experiment in exactly the same manner. One way to do this, you can also look at other papers that have been published on your topic to get some idea of what is included in this section. And in some cases, if you have a complex experimental protocol, for example, a very in-depth exercise intervention, it could be helpful to include a table to explain all the details of the protocol. You could refer them to an appendix, but usually you want to try to have it all contained here under the procedures section. But again, take the reader through exactly what the participants were to do in this study. So again, if you're doing a resistance training protocol, you would indicate what type of resistance training they did, how many sets, how many days a week, what was the resistance, how did you determine that? And then if it was aerobic, for example, you would take them through how did you progress them? What was their minutes per day? How many times a week did they do it? If it was a diet, what kind of diet did they do? What was the percent fat, protein, carbohydrates? What was the reduction in calories? So you'd want to take them through, the reader, take them through exactly what you have done. Here's an example of a procedure section that has insufficient detail. And you can see here that there's not a lot of detail about what the participants did. It's very vague and generic. And there's no way that someone could grasp exactly what an individual or the participants did. And you also, another researcher, it'd be almost impossible to replicate the study. I would assume if I saw something like this in your protocol, your proposal, that it was thrown together at the last minute, or there wasn't sufficient detail added. So this would be an incomplete procedure section. So again, err on the side of detail. Now here's an example of a procedural section that has sufficient detail. Now you can see that there's quite a bit of information provided about what the participants did. And this is the level at which your proposal should be written, again, in future tense. Now, there are times where you might be reading a manuscript where they do have word limitations. That does limit the amount of detail they can provide in maybe the hard copy. But now that things are going online, more journals are now publishing items online, the word limitation is not as big of a barrier. Or what they will do is they will then have a supplemental journal that the individuals can refer to for more information after they read the original manuscript. So these are some things to consider when you might see when reading a manuscript. But for your protocol, since there are no word limitations, I would expect this type of detail in your proposal. Just one note here. Notice here that we talk about the participants will need to have a chocolate milk in terms of this particular study. Here's an example where you would need to express that you would need to talk about if people who were lactose intolerant were excluded from the study, or instead were they given some kind of alternative drink that would give them the same type of macronutrient breakdown and the same bioavailability. So these are the kind of details you would want to include and be aware of when writing your proposal, because a reviewer would want to ask that question of individuals who might be lactose intolerant. Did that affect their participation? So you want to make sure that you would explain that in your proposal. But anyway, take a look at this, the amount of detail that's involved, and this is the type of detail that I would expect to see in your proposal. The next section is the data analysis section, and here is where you would include both how you reported descriptive statistics as well as inferential statistics. Again, the descriptive statistics deals with the percentages, frequencies, means, and standard deviations. And also now in inferential statistics, if there's, say, an interaction between two groups or over time, you would want to report how that would be. And if you have questions on how to do that, refer back to lesson number 7, as well as if you have questions, you can email me about how to write that. But again, this just gives you an idea of how you should write the statistics or data analysis section. Both include descriptive statistics as well as inferential statistics in terms of how you will be measuring them. You're not going to actually have to go about doing it, but you should at least talk about how you would perform that in your research study or proposal. For your research proposal, this will be essentially the end of it. We're going to talk a little bit about the results and discussion section, but that will not be included in your research proposal. So just keep that in mind that up to this point, this is what you should include in your research proposal. But we are going to touch a little bit on results and discussion. So this is the results section. It would be, again, after you did your study, you have results. Well, how are you going to present that to the reader in the manuscript? So again, your research proposal does not have a results section, but it's important for you to be aware of how these will be presented in a manuscript when you read the review of literature, for example. So in research reports, the results section, objectively, no interpretation reports the results of the statistical analysis. So in other words, the results section is pretty dry. You just state what the findings have been. There's really no analysis in this particular case. You don't talk about them. Excuse me, there's no analysis. What I mean by analysis, you don't start to interpret them and discuss them in the results section. You simply just report what the findings of the study were. Now, if a research study has more than one aim or purpose, research hypothesis or research question, the results section should address each separately, starting in the same order they were presented at the end of the introduction section. So if you talked about you're going to measure, let's say, the person's body weight and then their strength gains. So in this case, you would talk about their body weight changes first, and then you would talk about any strength gains after. So you would do it in the order that you mentioned it in the introduction is the order that you would want to report it in the results section. Now, how you report this depends on the area of where you're at in terms of your field. Different health science fields have different requirements. Some fields have APA format. Other fields have different types of how you report the results. You would just need to refer to the journal. Usually will also indicate how the format they want the results to be presented in, and you would just follow them. So following the results is the discussion section. And typically, the best way to do this is to give the reader, tell them a story in a sense. So the first paragraph usually restates the original purpose, the aims, and hypothesis to remind the reader of why the study was done. And then a brief summary of whether the purposes were achieved as represented by the research results. So essentially, you would say that the findings of the study indicated that the resistance training protocol had significant improvements in strength gains over 12 weeks, if your data indicated that. Now, specific statistics do not need to be reported in the discussion section, being the reader can find them in the results section. However, it is important to discuss how the results of the study compared to the studies reported in the introduction section. In other words, describe whether the results in your particular study are consistent with others in the literature or not, and the possible reasons why. It's important now that when you're doing the discussion that when you're comparing them from one study in the literature to your study, that you're not simply doing a descriptive analysis of here's all the studies that have been done before and here's what we did. A more effective way of doing this is where you're now focused on making a statement or a paragraph that talks about why something or you think something happened, and then you would follow up with, this agrees or disagrees with so-and-so, and the possible reasons are because they used a different protocol or they were much shorter in duration, and therefore it appears that our research studies show that our strength gains may have been seen due to the type of protocol we did as well as the length of the study. So usually what I see a lot of people when they start out writing discussions, they tend to just go and do almost a review of lit all over again in the discussion section, and that's not the case. You want to just talk about your report and then maybe and briefly how it differs from or agrees with what has been done in the past. Also, make sure in the discussion you limit your the degrees that you imply of cause and effect. That's very difficult to do in research studies. So you want to limit that in terms of those implications, that your study shows or proves something. You really can't prove something with one single study. Now the final part in terms of the discussion, towards the end of it, you want to dedicate 1 to 2 paragraphs to describe the strength and limitations of the research methodology and indicate how it might affect the interpretation of results. So, and usually in research studies, you say, here are some limitations as to what might have affected the outcomes of the study, and you would describe those. You also want to include a practical implications of the results. So in other words, if a practitioner or a clinician was reading your research study, how could they take what you've learned in your research study, and how could they actually apply it to their clients? Also, you might see that you'll see that in the discussion towards the end that they may identify future research directions and being as specific as possible so the recommendations are actually useful. This is actually a great way, a great location to find potentially for you research ideas if you're trying to do in the future or your own proposal. But this is a good way of finding things that could then further the research, and a way to do your own research is when you're reading the literature. Usually you'll see now future research in this area would be to study X, Y, and Z. So that would be a way to have good ideas going forward for new research studies to move the field forward. And in some cases, in the discussion section, it'll end with a very brief summary of the study findings and their practical implications. Just kind of put everything together, summarizing it one more time. But this is just the discussion section. Again, you won't have the results of discussion in your proposal, but it is where it'd be important to be aware of how they're written and when you're reviewing the literature. So this concludes this section. Make sure that you review this information not only for the quiz, but also for helping writing your proposal. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.